Hi, this is David Evans. I'm here at the Conference on Retroviruses and Opportunistic Infections. I'm talking to Dr. Scott Letendre, who is an Associate Professor of Medicine at the University of California in San Diego. Welcome.
Thank you, David.
You have presented some interesting data this year on how what is happening in the brain may not mirror what's happening in the peripheral blood. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
In the Charter study, which is a large cohort based in 6 cities in the U.S., we had a large number of CSF viral loads, and we could link those to the plasma viral loads. And we reported at the conference how they related to each other when we looked at one time point. But we also performed the analysis that you're referring to of looking at how they related over time. And in particular, we took people who were on antiretroviral therapy. They were suppressed below 50 copies per mil in plasma and in spinal fluid. And we looked to see what the predictors were of the time to loss of viral response, so how long they stayed suppressed. And there's some limitations in how we did the analysis, but what we found was that the overall, the correlates of times to loss of viral response were very similar in blood and CSF, but there were a few differences. And in particular, we found that in the spinal fluid, in CSF, that a few factors were associated with times to loss of viral response that were not associated with times to loss of viral response in blood. So people who had shorter times of loss of viral response, so they lost suppression more quickly of their virus. Those people were more likely to use an antiretroviral regimen that included a protease inhibitor. They were more likely to perform worse on the neuropsychological test and be black ethnically. And they were more likely to be on a poor penetrating regimen and be younger. So the converse was true, that the people who were on the better penetrating regimens and were older than about 44, seemed to have more durable responses in their spinal fluid, but that wasn't true in blood.
And that doesn't necessarily suggest that everybody on a protease inhibitor should go to switch to an NNRTI, but it does point us in the direction of perhaps some future research that ought to be done?
Yeah, so the strongest associations with those times to loss of viral response were the CD4 count, overall the ethnicity, whether they did well on the neuropsychological testing or not, and their age. But the other factors that I described were influential, but not as influential as those. So overall, we should still aim at controlling the plasma viral load, the viral load in blood first, and then consider these other factors. So it certainly doesn't suggest that people should switch from a protease inhibitor to a non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor. Those differences, they met our statistical test significance, but they weren't very large differences.
Okay. Well, related to that, there has been a notion that the more drug you can get into the brain, the better, the more protective it might be, or the more it might perhaps reverse, problems that are already occurring. There have been data presented this year that say that it may not be quite such a simple answer to that. Is that right?
Right. So I think what you're referring to is this idea of there being a therapeutic window that's been identified or thought about outside the nervous system, and so now we're starting to think about this idea inside the nervous system as well. And the idea is that if you don't have enough drug, that you can't control HIV as well, and so you'll have brain injury from persistent HIV replication. But if you have too much drug, then you're at increased risk perhaps for toxicity. So there was some data performed in the laboratory in cultures of neurons, the cells in the brain that do the primary work of the brain, showing that if for some drugs, if you had high concentrations, that you might have a greater injury of neurons. And so there's no data in people that directly relate to that, but they are sort of provocative findings from the laboratory that suggest that we should not maximize to the greatest extent possible penetration in everyone, that in some people it might be toxic. And I think, again, the idea of a therapeutic window is not a new one, but we ought to be thinking about what is an adequately penetrating regimen to control HIV in the nervous system without getting such high concentrations that we're putting people at risk for further injury.
Now, in closing, does the information that you're talking about, is that likely to change how someone is treated in the clinic, or is it more about, okay, well, this directs how further research needs to be done?
I think it directs on further research.
Okay.
So I think making blanket recommendations for everyone really is a challenge for implementing those in the clinic on designing a regimen that's best for a single person.
Sure.
So we can make these recommendations that are overall recommendations, but really each regimen has to be designed based on someone's the other conditions they have, what drugs they've been on before, and what toxicities they've had before, among other things. And so I think that the data are important. They will influence practice, but more work needs to be done before we strongly recommend implementing them in the clinic.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Okay.